After being abandoned by her children, the elderly woman left a special message in her will. The sun was just rising over the hills, illuminating the small rural village where Eleanor was born. Her life, from a very young age, was marked by simplicity and sacrifice. The countryside stretched along the horizon, and the adobe houses with their worn tile roofs seemed part of the landscape. In this humble setting, where time flowed slowly, family was the center of everything. For Eleanor, her family was her refuge and her entire universe. Her mother, Mrs. Maria, was the heart of the home. She rose long before the sun peeked over the horizon, lighting the wood stove to prepare breakfast. Elena often watched her mother from the kitchen door, admiring her strength and determination. Mrs. Maria never complained. Although her hands were cracked from hard work and her thin body showed the wear of years, she always wore a smile for her children. She was a woman whom life's hardships had not broken. Instead, they had somehow made her stronger. Don Francisco, Elena's father, was a man of few words. His presence was solid, like the land he plowed each day. He left early for the fields and didn't return until well into the afternoon. Although his face was always marked by seriousness, in the few moments he shared with his family, his gaze conveyed a deep devotion to them. It was his way of showing love, working tirelessly so there was always food on the table, even if it was scarce. Elena adored her father, but her true bond was with her older brother, Alfonso. Alfonso, 5 years her senior, was her protector and best friend. While Don Francisco represented stability and hard work, Alfonso was the dreamer of the family. On warm summer nights, after long days in the field, he would sit with Elena under the starry sky and tell her stories about the future. "One day, Elena," he would say, "we're going to get out of here. We will see the world. We won't always be trapped in this village." For Elena, those words were like divine promises. She believed wholeheartedly in her brother. As he spoke of adventures, of cities beyond the mountains, and a different life, Elena listened with eyes filled with admiration. Alfonso not only offered her a glimpse into a different future, but was also her emotional refuge. In him, she found hope that sometimes seemed hard to maintain amid daily struggles. Despite the poverty surrounding them, Eleanor felt fortunate to have a family that supported each other. At home, although worries were many and money was scarce, there was never a lack of a smile or an encouraging word. Mrs. Maria ensured that despite adversities, the atmosphere at home was warm. From a young age, Elena learned that while life might be tough, family love was what made everything bearable. "Family is the most important thing," her mother would tell her while kneading bread or sewing a worn garment. Those words remained etched in her heart as an undeniable truth. Life, although simple, was not without small moments of happiness. Eleanor fondly remembered the afternoons when she helped her mother wash clothes in the river, the sound of water running under their feet as they laughed and shared stories. There were also the evenings when her father returned from the fields with fresh fruits, a luxury they enjoyed together at dusk. Those moments felt eternal in Elena's mind, and even though they had little, she felt like they had everything. However, as Elena grew, she began to notice that not all dreams came true as easily as her brother made her believe. The reality of the village was harsh. Many young people, like her father, spent their lives working the fields, with no option but to accept their fate. But Alfonso always reminded her they were different. "We won't stay here forever," he insisted. "I'll find a way out, and I'll take you with me." Elena held on to those words. To her, Alfonso was not just her older brother, but also a light in the darkness, the promise of something beyond the limits of the village. Yet, deep down, she began to wonder if those promises could ever come true. Destiny, relentless, soon tested the family's strength. Alfonso, who had always been energetic and lively, began to show signs of weakness. At first, it was just a cold, or so everyone thought. But as the days passed, his condition did not improve. Alfonso, The dreamer, who always spoke of a bright future, began to lose strength. He could no longer work in the fields or spend nights talking with Elena under the stars. Concern engulfed the family. Mrs. Maria tried to remain optimistic, caring for Alfonso day and night. Don Francisco sought ways to find help, but the village lacked the necessary medical resources. Elena, still a child, felt the weight of uncertainty and fear. Watching her brother, her hero, weakened and ill, was an emotional burden she didn't know how to handle. The bond between Alfonso and Elena remained strong, even amid the illness. Alfonso, despite his frailty, continued to speak of his dreams. "Don't worry about me, Elena. You're going to get out of here. You'll fulfill everything I promised," he told her in his last moments of clarity, with a smile that now seemed weary and distant. The chapter ends with uncertainty in the air. Eleanor, standing beside her brother's bed, took his hand and felt that the world as she knew it was changing. The promise of a better future began to fade. But within her, something deeper started to take root, a strength that would lead her to face the challenges ahead. The air in the house had grown heavy. The laughter that once filled the rooms and the sounds of conversations under the stars had been replaced by whispers of prayers and constant worry. Alfonso, the pillar of hope in Elena's life, lay in bed, growing weaker each day. Time passed like a silent storm, taking with it the vitality of her brother, the same one who had spoken to her of a future full of promises. Elena, who had spent her early years believing that life would always have an escape, began to feel the weight of reality on her shoulders. Alfonso's illness was not just a physical challenge, it was a shadow that loomed over the entire family. Mrs. Maria continued to maintain her strength, but each day her eyes showed the fear she tried to hide. Don Francisco, though always a man of few words, spent more time in the fields, perhaps to avoid facing the possibility of losing his son. The days became a routine of care and prayers. Elena helped her mother change the cold compresses on Alfonso's forehead, feed him the soup he could barely swallow, and sat with him during the nights, hoping he would wake up. But Alfonso, who used to fill her with energy and hope, now seemed increasingly distant. One afternoon, when the sun had set behind the mountains, Eleanor approached her brother's bed. His breathing was soft, barely a whisper. She looked closely at him, searching his face for a sign of the strong, dream-filled young man she admired so much, but all she saw was the weariness of a life slipping away. She took his hand, thinner than she remembered, and felt the coolness of his skin. Alfonso opened his eyes slightly, and with a voice almost inaudible, whispered, "Don't worry, Elena. Even when I'm gone, you will fulfill our dreams." Those words, once a promise, now sounded like a farewell. Eleanor felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. She knew Alfonso needed to see her strong, as she had always been, even though inside she was falling apart. Her brother closed his eyes again, and that would be the last time she saw him conscious. Alfonso's death came like a sigh at dawn. The home that had been a refuge of hope was engulfed in deep mourning. Mrs. Maria, who had always been the backbone of the family, fell to her knees upon receiving the news, unable to contain the pain she had kept under control until then. Don Francisco, in his own way, retreated to the fields without saying a word, but his gaze reflected a void Eleanor had never seen before. The funeral was simple, as one would expect from a family with little to offer. Neighbors came to express their condolences, and the bells of the small church rang out in the cold morning air. Elena remained silent throughout the ceremony, her heart tightly clenched in her chest, feeling as if the entire world was becoming unreal, as if everything around her were happening in a distant movie. There was no way to prepare for the emptiness Alfonso left behind. Eleanor searched for him in every corner of the house, in every moment of the day, hoping to hear his voice calling her to share more of his dreams and adventures. But all she found was overwhelming silence. The absence of her brother hung in the air like a fog that wouldn't dissipate. As the days went by, Elena began to understand that something inside her had changed. At 13, the loss of Alfonso forced her to mature in a way no child should. Don Francisco continued to work tirelessly in the fields, while Mrs. Maria immersed herself in household chores, trying to fill the void with work. But within Elena, sadness began to transform into something else, a sense of responsibility she had never felt before. The promise of Alfonso echoed in her mind. "You will fulfill our dreams." Even though her brother was no longer there, Elena felt she had a mission, a debt to him, and the sacrifice he had made. However, the weight of that promise also brought guilt. She felt she had failed him, that she hadn't done enough to save him, even though she was just a child and couldn't have changed their fate. This blend of pain, guilt, and responsibility began to shape Elena. She transformed into a more serious young woman, less concerned with the simple pleasures of childhood and more focused on her family's needs. She began to help her mother more, not only with household chores, but also in making important decisions, feeling that she had to assume the role that Alfonso had left vacant. The days of play and laughter were behind her, replaced by sacrifice as a natural part of life. Over time, the community began to see Elena as a strong and determined girl, despite still being a teenager. However, deep in her heart, sadness remained. She never spoke openly about her grief, not even to her mother, who was also grappling with her own sorrow. Instead, she kept everything inside, trying to meet the expectations she now felt resting on her shoulders. Elena had come to realize something crucial. Life was not always fair, nor did it follow the dreams one had imagined. The sacrifices of her parents, the pain of losing her brother, these became lessons for her. Family was everything, just as her mother had taught her, and though it meant sacrificing her own desires, she was willing to do it. If Alfonso couldn't fulfill his dreams, she would ensure that her family, in some way, would be okay. With that determination in mind, Elena moved into a new phase of her life. Although the pain of losing her brother would always accompany her, she now saw life with a more realistic outlook. She understood that dreams did not always come true, but she also recognized that the strength to face life lay within her, a lesson Alfonso had left her as his final gift. Elena had learned to live with the emptiness Alfonso left behind. Over the years, she became a strong and determined young woman, the backbone of her home. As her parents aged, Elena took on more responsibilities. The mornings in the fields, the chores around the house, everything seemed to revolve around keeping her family afloat. But something within her always felt missing. Though she never voiced it, she missed those dreams of escaping, of seeing the world, of finding something beyond the hills that surrounded the village. It was in this context that Robert entered her life. Robert arrived in the village like a breath of fresh air. He was a young mechanic with strong hands and bright eyes, a man full of energy and ambition. The moment he set foot in the village, his name began to circulate among the neighbors. "That boy is eager to get ahead," they said. And somehow, Elena felt drawn to him from the very first moment. Their first meeting was casual, like those moments that mark a life forever. Elena saw him for the first time while walking toward the village store, and there was Robert, with his sleeves rolled up, grease-stained to the elbows as he worked on an old car. He looked up, and their eyes met for a brief instant. Something in the way he looked at her made her heart skip a beat, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Alfonso's death. From then on, their paths seemed to intertwine naturally. Robert, with his easy smile and unbreakable optimism, quickly became a regular presence in Elena's life. At first, he was just another acquaintance, someone with whom she exchanged brief words when they met at the market or in church. But gradually, those conversations grew longer, until one day, Robert decided to invite her for a walk on the outskirts of the village. On that walk, as the afternoon bathed in orange hues, Robert shared his dreams with her, the cities he wanted to see, the businesses he planned to open. Elena listened, fascinated, for in him she saw a reflection of Alfonso, with his grand plans and faith in a different future. Robert not only attracted her physically, but he also reignited something she thought had died: hope. The walks became more frequent, and soon what began as a simple friendship transformed into something deeper. Robert was unlike any other man in the village. He didn't settle for rural life, working from dawn to dusk without ambitions beyond mere survival. He wanted more, and Elena, who had lived so long under the weight of sacrifice and family obligation, felt that being close to him opened a window to the world she had always dreamed of. One day, while sitting under a tree by the river, Robert took her hand and told her what her heart already knew. "Elena, I want you to be part of my life. We will build something great together." Those words resonated within her like a melody. For the first time since Alfonso's death, someone was offering her the chance to dream again, to see beyond the limits of the village. And while part of her was scared, a larger part wanted to take the risk. Elena accepted his proposal, and shortly after, they married in a simple ceremony surrounded by family and friends from the village. Mrs. Maria, though proud of her daughter, couldn't help but worry. Robert was a man full of ideas, but his ambition also made her uneasy. "Elena, my daughter, work and money aren't everything in life," she would say with a cautionary expression. But Elena, in love and blinded by the bright future she envisioned, didn't pay much attention to those words. To her, Robert was the promise of a new life, and she was willing to follow him to the end. The first years of their marriage were happy. Robert, although he worked long hours in the workshop he had set up, always returned home with a smile and new ideas to expand his business. They had dreams of building a strong family, and soon those dreams began to materialize with the birth of their first child, Mark. Eleanor felt that, finally, life was giving her a second chance to fulfill the desires she had kept in her heart for so long. However, over time, something in Robert began to change. What had once been a shared and hopeful ambition began to morph into an obsession. Robert was no longer the same man who had promised her a future filled with love and adventure. He spent increasing hours in the workshop, focused on earning more money, growing his business, and chasing a success that never seemed to be enough. Elena, for her part, began to notice the growing distance between them. Although she still loved Robert, their priorities no longer seemed aligned. She wanted to build a home, raise a family, and while she valued hard work, she also knew life shouldn't revolve solely around material success. But Robert became increasingly consumed by his projects and the pursuit of wealth, neglecting the small things that had once united them. With the arrival of Laura, their second daughter, and then Charles, the youngest, Elena found herself alone managing the household. She took care of the children, prepared meals, and ensured nothing was lacking at home, while Robert remained immersed in his world of work and ambition. The days of walks and hopeful conversations had faded away, leaving only the weight of routine. Despite this, Elena didn't complain. She had learned from her mother that sacrifice was part of life, and if that meant taking the lead role in the home, then so be it. After all, it had always been her nature to care for others, and her children had become her top priority. Through them, she found meaning in her life, even as her relationship with Robert seemed to slowly crumble. Yet deep in her heart, she couldn't shake the question of whether she had done right by following Robert so blindly. Had she confused ambition with love? Had she placed her dreams of happiness in a man who, in the end, sought only personal success? Although these questions troubled her, Eleanor pressed on, convinced that somehow she would find a way to save her marriage. Unbeknownst to her, Eleanor was entering a new stage of her life, one where sacrifice, once again, would become her only option. Robert's promise of a better life blurred with each passing day, and although she didn't know it at that moment, she was about to face challenges far greater than those she had imagined when she married him. The birth of Mark was a moment of deep joy for Elena. Holding him in her arms, she felt a new reason to push forward, a renewed hope in her life, even as Robert began to show signs of distancing himself. Her son was a source of light, a promise that maybe the dreams she shared with Robert could still come true, not through travel or adventures, but through the family they were building together. In the early months, Robert was present. Although he remained focused on his workshop, he still had tender moments with Elena and Mark. Sometimes he would sit with her at the kitchen table, sharing his plans for the future, about how he would someday open a larger business in the city and give them a more comfortable life. Though those moments became increasingly rare, Elena held onto them, believing that Robert's ambition was still tied to the family they had formed. However, when Laura arrived, the situation began to change more drastically. Robert's workshop was already growing and demanding more of his time and energy. The long hours he dedicated to work left no room for family dinners or the walks they used to share. Robert started staying late at the shop, always obsessed with earning more money, expanding the business, and ensuring that nothing could fail. To him, success was the only measure of progress, and nothing else seemed to matter. Elena, on the other hand, was fully dedicated to her children. She woke up before dawn, prepared breakfast, cared for Mark and Laura, and then took care of household chores. Each day turned into a marathon of responsibilities. Yet, despite the exhaustion, Elena found satisfaction in caring for her family. She had been raised with the belief that sacrificing for loved ones was the most valuable thing one could offer, and for that reason, she never complained. Still, she began to notice that her marriage was no longer what it used to be. Robert was not only physically absent, but also seemed emotionally distant. During the few occasions they sat together for dinner, conversations revolved around work and money. The smiles and laughter that once filled their home were fading, replaced by the uncomfortable silence of two people who, though living under the same roof, no longer understood each other. The arrival of their third child, Charles, brought even more responsibilities for Elena. While Robert remained immersed in his business, Elena took on nearly all the childcare for the three kids. Laura, being the middle child, required special attention, while Mark began to show signs of a personality like his father's, ambitious and focused on success from an early age. Charles, the baby, demanded constant attention, and Elena, although exhausted, ensured that each of her children had what they needed. Robert, for his part, spent less and less time at home. The workshop became his sole focus, and although his income began to grow, it did so at the expense of his relationship with Elena and the children. The days when they used to dream together about the future felt like a distant memory. Now, when they spoke, they only argued over bills or decisions related to the shop. The love that once united them was getting lost in a sea of daily worries and excessive ambitions. True to her nature, Elena tried to maintain peace at home. Whenever she could, she organized small family gatherings, attempting to reclaim some of the warmth that had once connected them. She prepared Robert's favorite meals, invited the children to sit together at the table, and did her best to make those moments memorable. However, Robert always had an excuse. "I have too much work at the shop," "I can't stay," "There are customers waiting," or "This business isn't going to grow by itself." Each of those excuses felt like a small wound in Elena's heart. She knew Robert worked for the family's sake, but it became harder for her to believe that was the only reason for his obsession. It seemed that, little by little, material success had become more important than the moments they shared as a family. Robert was no longer the optimistic dreamer she had married, but someone who viewed money and work as the only paths to happiness. The children, although small, began to notice their father's absence. Mark, especially, absorbed that distance and started to behave similarly. Although he was just a boy, he already showed an inclination toward numbers, the cold logic of money and success. Elena saw in him a shadow of what Robert was becoming, and while she tried to teach him values of love and sacrifice, she feared that his father's influence would be stronger than her own efforts. Laura, on the other hand, began to express a desire to escape the family environment. She often spoke of the city, of the bright lights, and the life she imagined beyond the village. As she grew older, she seemed increasingly detached from the world her mother tried to show her, seeking a more exciting life, one less burdened by the sacrifices Eleanor had endured. Charles, being the youngest, was the most innocent of all, but even he started to sense the tension at home. Elena found herself in a constant dilemma. She loved her children with all her heart and would do anything for them, but she also began to feel that her relationship with Robert was crumbling beyond repair. They were no longer a team. They no longer shared the same dreams. Each day, Elena felt the weight of sacrifice resting solely on her shoulders. While Robert pursued his own ambitions, she managed the household, raised the children, and juggled the family finances. One night, after a long day, Eleanor sat in the kitchen while the kids slept. She listened to the ticking of the clock on the wall, waiting for the familiar sound of the door opening, indicating that Robert had returned from the workshop. But the sound never came. She was left alone, surrounded by the silence of a home that had once been filled with love and shared dreams. And for the first time, she felt a pang of doubt. Had she made the right decisions? Had she confused love with the promise of a bright future? Though she loved Robert and wanted to believe that their marriage could be saved, reality began to present itself with painful clarity. The life they had built was on the verge of collapse, and Robert, blinded by his ambition, didn't even notice. Elena, always strong, always willing to sacrifice, began to wonder if there was a limit to what she could endure. But one thing was certain. No matter how difficult the situation became, she would continue fighting for her children. She had lost her brother, had given up her own dreams, and now, although her marriage seemed to be falling apart, she was determined not to lose the most important thing she had left: her family. Over the years, the distance between Robert and Eleanor expanded not only physically, but also emotionally. Each day that Robert spent more hours at the shop, Eleanor felt their marriage crumbling a bit more. The dreams they had once shared faded amid the bustle of the workshop, the bills to pay, and the accumulated fatigue of their daily lives. Robert, who had once been a man full of promises and energy, had become a stranger within his own home. The love that had once motivated him seemed to have been replaced by an insatiable ambition for success. The days when he used to return home with a smile on his face and some story about a new customer or an exciting project were long gone. Now he came home late, exhausted, and rarely spoke to Elena or the children. Elena, for her part, had tried everything within her power to maintain family unity. She organized special dinners, attempted to revive the conversations of old, and even sought moments for them to spend time alone as a couple, but every effort proved futile. Robert always had an excuse. The business needs me, I'm exhausted, or simply did not respond to Elena's attempts at connection. With 3 children demanding his attention and an emotionally absent husband, Elena found herself increasingly alone in her marriage. Yet she didn't let her children notice the pain she carried. She woke up early each morning to ensure that Mark, Laura, and Charles had everything they needed before heading off to school. She prepared lunches, helped with homework, and kept the house in order, no matter how exhausted she felt. As the children grew, they began to perceive the tension that hung in the air. Mark, the oldest, resembled his father in character. At just 12 years old, he already displayed a tendency to obsess over success and money. Robert, in his brief conversations with Mark, seemed to encourage those attitudes, talking to him about the importance of being the best and not falling behind. Elena watched in worry as her son adopted his father's cold ambition, fearing he too would fall into the trap of valuing material things above all else. Laura, on the other hand, was in the midst of her teenage years, and her desire to escape the rural environment became increasingly evident. She spent hours talking about the city, dreaming of a life far from the countryside, filled with luxuries and opportunities. For her, the life she led in the village felt like a prison, and her connection with her family, especially with Elena, began to weaken. Each passing day, Laura drifted further away emotionally, immersed in fantasies of a glamorous future she believed she deserved. Charles, the youngest, was still innocent enough not to fully comprehend what was happening around him. However, even he noticed that his father was almost never home, and that when he was, he rarely showed interest in spending time with them. Charles, who had once been a cheerful and lively boy, began to exhibit signs of insecurity and a tendency to seek constant approval from others, especially from his mother. Eleanor, aware of the impact Robert's absence was having on their children, tried to compensate for his lack of attention. She devoted all her time and energy to them, but the physical and emotional exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. Some nights, when everyone was asleep, Elena would sit in the kitchen, staring at a cold cup of tea, reflecting on her life. How had she reached this point? How could she feel so alone in her own home, surrounded by the people she loved most? The distance between her and Robert continued to grow, and what had once been a marriage full of promises and love was now a functional relationship focused solely on daily responsibilities. Conversations that used to revolve around their dreams and hopes had dwindled to monotonous exchanges about bills, food, or home repairs. The sparkle in Robert's eyes that had once captivated Elena had dimmed, replaced by a distant, calculating look, always focused on the next step to increase his profits. Elena tried to remember how her life had been before everything became so complicated. She recalled the walks with Robert, the moments of intimacy, and the promises he had made her about a better future. But now, all those promises seemed hollow. The future Robert pursued no longer included love, family, and shared time, but rather revolved around financial success and the accumulation of wealth. Worst of all, he didn't even seem to realize what he was losing in the process. One night, after a silent dinner where Robert barely touched his food before heading back to the workshop, Eleanor decided to confront him. She waited until he returned, close to midnight. When she saw him walk in, shirt still stained with grease and his face tense, she knew this would be a pivotal moment. "Robert, we need to talk," Elena said, trying to control the emotions that threatened to spill over. Robert stopped in his tracks, surprised by the serious tone in his wife's voice. He glanced at her briefly before dropping into a chair, as if the weight of the day had suddenly crashed down on him. "What's wrong, Elena? I'm exhausted. If this is about the kids, we can talk tomorrow." But Elena was not willing to wait any longer. "It's not just about the kids. It's about us, about this life we're leading. You're drifting away from everyone, Robert. You're not the man I married anymore." Robert frowned, as if he didn't understand what she was talking about. "Elena, everything I do for you and the kids. I'm working hard to secure our future. Don't you get it? Without the shop, without the money, we wouldn't have anything." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat, but she refused to let tears fall. She knew this was the moment to be strong. "And what good is all that money if we're not together? You're here physically, but not really. You've forgotten what matters, Robert. Family is more than just paying the bills. We are losing each other, and the kids are noticing." Robert sat in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he sighed and stood up. "You don't understand, Elena. The world isn't like it used to be. If I don't push myself now, we will never get ahead. All this, it's necessary." Without another word, he turned and headed toward the bedroom door. Eleanor remained in the kitchen, alone once more, feeling as though she had lost a battle she never knew how to win. She understood that Robert believed he was doing the right thing, but she also knew they were paying too high a price. That night, as she listened to Robert's footsteps fading down the hall, Eleanor realized that the man she had married no longer existed. The sacrifice she was willing to make for her family was not the same as what Robert was prepared to give. And though she wouldn't admit it at that moment, deep down, she knew their marriage was broken. Exhausted and emotionally hurt, Elena decided her only option was to move forward for the sake of her children. While her relationship with Robert was no longer what she had dreamed of, she still had a mission: to raise her children and ensure they had a future filled with love and stability, something only she seemed capable of offering. The sun had begun to set behind the mountains when Elena heard the phone ring. It was one of those afternoons when everything felt like it had come to a standstill. The children were busy with their homework, and she was in the kitchen, as always, preparing dinner. The sound of the phone shattered the tranquility, and a wave of unease washed over her. She answered with a calm voice, but on the other end, the voice she heard was not the one she expected. It was one of Robert's co-workers, his tone serious and restrained. "Elena, it's about Robert. He's had a heart attack at the shop, and he didn't make it." The news struck like lightning in the middle of the calm. The world around Elena faded away in that instant. Elena was frozen, the phone still in her hand, unable to process what she had just heard. Robert, her husband, the man with whom she had built a family, the father of her children, was gone. The reality of his death was hard to accept, despite the years of emotional distance that had accumulated between them. No matter everything that had happened, she couldn't imagine a world without him. The hours that followed were a blur. Informing the children was one of the hardest tasks she had ever faced. Mark, despite his youth, adopted a cold, calculating expression almost identical to his father's. He didn't shed a single tear, but the emptiness in his eyes spoke louder than any cry. Laura, on the other hand, displayed her frustration, angry at the world, at Robert, and at fate. She couldn't understand how someone could spend so much time working, and in the end, have nothing to show for it, not even a united family. Charles, the youngest, broke into tears, unable to process what his father's death meant. The funeral was simple, just as Robert would have wanted it, without luxuries or extravagances. The townspeople came to offer their condolences, but the atmosphere was filled with a sense of emptiness. Mark remained silent throughout, arms crossed and brow furrowed. Laura stood apart, almost as if she wanted to flee from it all, while Charles clung tightly to Elena, afraid of losing the only constant figure he had left. As the days went by, the house filled with a strange silence. Robert was no longer there to leave early or return late. His physical absence was evident, but what hurt Elena most was the lack of emotional closure. There were so many unspoken words, so many unanswered questions. Why had he allowed work to become his only refuge? Why had he emotionally abandoned his family even before his death? Yet, there was no time for lamentation. Elena knew her children needed her more than ever, but soon she realized that Robert's death had triggered a new stage in their lives, one that filled her with uncertainty. Mark, who had already shown a tendency to follow in his father's footsteps, now seemed more distant than ever. After the funeral, he stopped talking about his father, diving into his own projects and ambitions. For him, Robert's death seemed to signal that he needed to double his efforts to achieve success, no matter the cost. Mark began to spend more time away from home, focusing on his studies and, later, his career. Elena barely saw him, and when she did, the conversations were cold and superficial. The boy who once played in the yard, full of questions and laughter, had vanished, leaving in his place a young man who valued material achievements more than family love. Every time Elena tried to reach out to him, Mark would shut down further, as if afraid to show any signs of weakness. Laura, for her part, took her father's death as an excuse to distance herself even more from the family. She had grown up longing for a life away from the village, and now, with Robert's departure, felt that there was nothing tying her to that place. As soon as she had the chance, she moved to the city, chasing a life of luxury and superficiality. To her, life in the countryside, filled with sacrifices and responsibilities, was not something she wanted for her future. Elena tried to keep in touch with Laura, but every time she called, their conversations were brief and distant. Laura was more interested in talking about her new friends, her social life, and the parties she attended than about her mother's or siblings' well-being. Charles, the youngest, was the one who suffered the most from his father's loss. Although Robert had been emotionally absent, Charles still viewed him as a figure to admire. However, his father's death left him lost and confused. He began to struggle in school, skipping classes and avoiding responsibilities. It seemed he was searching for ways to escape reality, avoiding confronting the pain he felt from the loss. Amid all this emotional chaos, Elena tried to stay strong, but her heart was filled with a sadness she didn't know how to handle. She had spent much of her life sacrificing for her family, always putting others' needs above her own. But now, with Robert gone, her children began to see her more as a burden than as a mother. Despite everything she had done for them, it seemed that the legacy of sacrifice she had tried to instill had been lost along the way. The distance from her children was the most painful for Eleanor. She had spent years teaching them the value of family, love, and sacrifice, but it seemed that everything had crumbled. Mark was obsessed with money and success. Laura was captivated by the superficiality of a life filled with luxuries, and Charles was lost in the confusion of his youth. Eleanor watched them drift away from her, one by one, and didn't know how to stop it. Sometimes, while gazing out the kitchen window, she remembered the days when her children were little, when she could still protect and guide them. She recalled the afternoons when they ran around the yard, full of energy and laughter, and how she used to think those moments would last forever. But now, those memories were just shadows, echoes of a time she could no longer reclaim. Loneliness began to seep into the home. Although her children continued to live under her roof for a time, it felt as if they weren't really present. Mark rarely joined them for dinner, Laura barely called from the city, and Charles spent more and more time in his room, distant and absent. Eleanor, who had dedicated her entire life to her family, now found herself alone, burdened by a home devoid of affection. Robert's death had not only left a void in the house, but also forced Elena to confront a painful truth. Her children no longer saw her as a mother to whom they could turn for support and love, but rather as an awkward responsibility. The pain of that realization was deeper than any sacrifice she had made before. Despite everything, Eleanor did not lose hope. She still believed in the strength of family, in the love that had once united them, and in her ability to reconnect with her children, even though the future appeared increasingly uncertain. Determined not to give up, Elena quietly began to devise a plan, one that would eventually change her children's lives forever. The days following Robert's funeral passed in uncomfortable silence. The house, which had once been filled with life and the promise of a bright future, now felt empty and cold. Eleanor, who had always been the heart of the family, was trying to move forward, but it was becoming increasingly evident that her children were disconnected from her and from what their home had once meant. Mark, busier every day with work and his own interests, barely spent time at home. Laura, immersed in her superficial life in the city, only called occasionally, and when she did, her conversations with Elena were quick, almost forced. Charles, the youngest, who had always shown a more vulnerable side, began to distance himself even more. His evasive attitude and poor choices started to worry Elena, but stopping the downward spiral seemed impossible. Elena found herself at a critical juncture. Her health, which had withstood years of sacrifice, began to show signs of wear. She felt increasingly tired, weaker, as if the weight of years of effort and struggle was finally catching up with her. Still, she didn't allow herself to complain. Deep within, she held on to the duty of caring for her family, even though that family no longer viewed her in the same light. One afternoon, while preparing dinner for Charles, who still lived with her, Mark arrived unannounced. His serious face and rigid posture immediately concerned Elena. They sat in the living room in an uncomfortable silence until Mark finally spoke up. "Mom, I've been thinking about your situation, and I think it's time to make a decision about the future," Mark began bluntly. Elena looked at him, confused by his words. "What do you mean, son?" she asked, trying to keep her calm. Mark took a deep breath, as if he were about to say something he had been planning for a while. "You can't keep living here alone. Your health is deteriorating, and this place is no longer what it used to be. I think the best thing for you would be to move to a place where they can take care of you, a nursing home. I've already researched one that's very good on the outskirts of the city. They have doctors, activities, and I assure you, you'll be well taken care of." Mark's words fell like a ton of bricks on Elena. She had never imagined her children would come to see her as a burden that needed to be managed rather than a mother who should be cared for. Her heart shrank, but she forced herself to remain calm. "A nursing home," she repeated softly, trying to process what that meant. She had never thought her fate would end up in such a place, away from her home, away from everything she had built. Mark, seeing his mother's reaction, rushed to justify his decision. "Mom, I'm doing this for you. You can't keep doing everything on your own. You know I'm busy with work, Laura doesn't live here, and Charles, well, you know he's not someone you can rely on to help you. This place will offer you what we can't." Elena remained silent. She felt that her voice had been lost somewhere within her. She knew Mark believed he was doing the right thing, but for her, it was a devastating blow. Everything she had done, all the sacrifices she had made, seemed to fade away in that moment. She had raised her children with the values of sacrifice, love, and family unity. But now those very children saw her as a weight they didn't want to bear. "I didn't talk to Laura or Charles about this, but I'm sure they'll agree. The best thing for everyone is for you to be in a place where you can be taken care of properly," Mark continued, oblivious to the pain on his mother's face. At that moment, Charles walked into the room. Hearing the conversation, his face showed a mix of surprise and distress. "A nursing home? Really, Mark? Is that what you think Mom needs?" he asked, frowning. Mark looked at him coldly. "And what do you propose, Charles? That we keep pretending everything is fine while Mom gets worse and worse? You know none of us can take care of her like we should." Charles, though always the most unstable of the three, felt uncomfortable with the idea of leaving their mother in a nursing home. However, he also knew he wasn't in a position to offer an alternative. His own problems consumed him, and though he wouldn't say it out loud, part of him shared the sentiment that leaving Elena in a nursing home was the most convenient way out. Listening to her two sons argue over her future as if she wasn't even there, Eleanor felt a part of her breaking. She knew she couldn't fight them. Although her heart longed to stay in her home, her body no longer had the strength to keep taking care of everything. And the most painful part was knowing that her children saw no other option because deep down they no longer viewed her as the strong mother who had raised them, but rather as a responsibility to be shed. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "If you believe it's for the best, then I will accept." There were no reproaches, no tears, just a silent acceptance of a reality she couldn't change. The days following that conversation were the most painful Eleanor had experienced in a long time. Charles didn't mention it again and remained distant. Laura, when called to inform her, agreed without asking too many questions. For her, it was the most practical solution, as it allowed her to continue her life uninterrupted. And Mark, with his usual coldness, took charge of organizing everything as if he were handling a simple transaction. The day Elena arrived at the nursing home was one of the hardest she had ever faced. She said goodbye to the house that had been her refuge, to the rooms filled with memories, to the laughter of her children when they were small. She knew she would never set foot in that place again, never feel the warmth of her home. As she crossed the threshold of the nursing home, she felt as though a part of her life had definitively faded away. The nursing home, though clean and well kept, was not her home. The nurses greeted her with kind but cold smiles. The room assigned to her was small, with barely a bed and a table. Despite her efforts to be strong, the emptiness inside her grew with each step. Her children, who had barely been present that day, said their quick goodbyes, promising to visit soon. But Elena knew those visits would become fewer and fewer until eventually they would stop altogether. That first night in the nursing home, Eleanor sat on the bed, gazing out the small window that overlooked a lifeless garden. She felt utterly alone. There were no more responsibilities to tend to, no more sacrifices to make. Only loneliness remained. And for the first time in a long while, Elena allowed the tears to fall silently down her face. However, amid that pain, an idea began to take shape in her mind. She didn't want to leave this world without leaving something for her children, without helping them understand what truly mattered. She had spent her life teaching them about sacrifice and the importance of family, but somehow those values had been lost along the way. It was in that moment, in that small room of the nursing home, that Elena decided that even though her children had abandoned her, she would not abandon them. With the little energy she had left, she began to plan a final act of love, a special message she would leave in her will, something that would remind them of who she was and all that she had done for them. The nursing home where Eleanor had been placed was a clean place with friendly staff and a strict routine that was followed without fail. However, despite its orderliness and cleanliness, the environment always felt cold and distant to Elena. No matter how many efforts the staff made to make her feel comfortable, she knew it would never be her home. Days passed one after another, in a monotony that gradually sank her deeper into loneliness. The visits from her children, as she had feared, began to dwindle. Mark was completely absorbed in his work, and although he initially promised to spend weekends with her, those visits soon turned into quick phone calls, more out of obligation than desire. Laura, immersed in her luxurious life in the city, barely took the time to call, and when she did, their conversations were short and empty. Charles, lost in his own personal chaos, rarely showed up, and when he did, he was always in a hurry, unable to confront the reality his mother faced. Despite the pain of feeling forgotten by her own children, Eleanor persevered, facing each day with the same dignity she had maintained throughout her life. She did not complain, did not protest. She had spent too long sacrificing for her family to change now. However, deep down in her heart, a feeling of sadness and abandonment began to grow. Amid that sadness, a ray of light entered Elena's life in the form of Sophia, a nurse who worked at the nursing home. Sophia was a woman in her 50s, with a serene demeanor and tired but kind eyes. She moved through the nursing home with a calmness that contrasted with the apathetic routine of the place. Although she had many responsibilities, she always found time to sit with the residents, listen to their stories, and share a kind word. Sophia had noticed Elena from the very first day. Something in her bearing and silence caught her attention. While others in the nursing home complained or demanded constant attention, Elena always sat in her corner, silent and dignified, as if her pain were too personal to share. It was that quiet strength that led Sophia to reach out to her. At first, Eleanor didn't know what to think of Sophia. She was used to being seen as just another elderly woman in the nursing home, someone to be attended to and little more. But Sophia didn't treat her that way. She spoke to her as if she genuinely cared about what she had to say, as if she saw beyond her appearance as an older woman and recognized the person she had been, the mother and wife who had dedicated her entire life to others. Over time, Eleanor began to open up to Sophia. The two women found a space of relief in their conversations. As days passed, they shared stories about their lives, their families, their pains, and their hopes. Through those talks, Elena discovered that Sophia had also been abandoned by her own children. Sophia shared that she had devoted years to caring for her parents, and when they passed away, she had hoped her children would care for her in her old age. But like Elena, Sophia had been sidelined, ignored by those to whom she had given everything. Elena felt a deep connection with Sophia. Although they were from different generations, they shared the same pain, the same feeling of having been forgotten by those they loved most. In that connection, they both found comfort. They didn't need words to understand each other. Simply being together in the nursing home garden, watching the flowers begin to wilt, offered them solace they had not expected to find. It was on one of those afternoons in the garden, while they talked about life and the sacrifices they had both made, that Elena began to think about what she would leave behind. The idea that her children would remember her only as a woman who had been sent to a nursing home was unbearable. She had dedicated her entire life to them, and even though they had now forgotten her, she didn't want her legacy to be reduced to that. Elena shared with Sophia about her children, the sacrifices she had made for them, and how, despite everything, she felt that something had been lost along the way. She had taught them to work hard and to value sacrifice, but at some point, those values had become distorted. Her children had turned into people who valued material success above all else, and the love she had given them seemed to have faded in the process. Sophia, listening intently, took her hand and told her something that resonated deeply with Elena. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is to leave a final message that makes those left behind reflect. They may not see it now, but perhaps in the future, when you're gone, your words will guide them. That conversation sparked something in Elena. She decided she would not leave this world without leaving a special message for her children, something that would make them stop and reflect on their lives, on the love and sacrifice she had given them. She didn't want to leave them just material possessions, but a life lesson, a final testament of her unconditional love. With Sophia's help, Elena began writing letters for each of her children. They were not simple farewell letters. They were messages filled with memories, lessons, and reflections. Each letter contained special moments from their childhood, stories they might have forgotten, but that were essential to Elena. She reminded them of how she cared for them when they were little, how she sacrificed her own dreams for them, and spoke to them about the value of family, of love that is never measured in terms of material success, but in the small, everyday gestures of affection. Mark, Laura, and Charles would each receive a unique letter, written with the hope that one day, when Elena was no longer there, they would understand the true value of everything she had done for them. Sophia, seeing Elena's dedication in writing those letters, offered to help her with the legal details. They contacted Michael, a lawyer who had worked in the city for years, and who, upon hearing Elena's story, was deeply moved by her desire to leave an emotional legacy rather than just a material inheritance. Michael helped Elena organize her will. Along with whatever possessions she could leave to her children, the letters would become the most important part of her legacy. Each would be delivered at the right moment, ensuring that even though she would no longer be present, her voice, her love, and her sacrifice would reach them in a way they could never ignore. As the days went by, Elena felt at peace. Though she knew her children wouldn't change overnight, she trusted that one day her words would touch them and make them reflect. They might not understand during her lifetime everything she had done for them, but with those letters, with that last special message, she would give them a chance to redeem themselves, to reconnect with what truly mattered. Elena knew her time was running out, but she no longer felt fear or sadness. She was surrounded by Sophia's kindness and had made peace with her own fate. Her children, though distant, remained her greatest pride, and although they did not understand it yet, she had given them everything she could, her unconditional love, expressed in one final act of sacrifice and hope. Elena felt that time was slipping through her fingers, but unlike in previous years, she no longer feared the end. She had made peace with the life she had led and with the decisions she had made, even those that had led her to sacrifice so much for her children. She knew that, although they might not understand her at that moment, the letters she had written were her last act of love and her greatest legacy. One morning, as the sun barely illuminated the nursing home garden, Elena awoke feeling a strange calm in her chest. Sophia had been more attentive to her health in recent weeks, aware that Elena's body was beginning to fail. But Elena did not complain. She spent her days in the garden, watching the flowers, reminiscing about her life, and writing small fragments of memories in her mind, knowing that the end was near. That morning, while sipping hot tea in her room, Elena closed her eyes for a few minutes, feeling her breathing become slower. There was no pain or fear, just a deep peace, as if she were preparing for a long, quiet journey. When Sophia entered the room to check on her, she immediately knew something had changed. Eleanor had slipped away quietly, just as she had lived the last years of her life. Sophia approached her bed, moved, and knelt beside her. There were no tears immediately, only a profound sense of respect and admiration for a woman who had endured so much without complaint, who had loved with all her being, and who, even in death, seemed at peace. The news of her passing quickly reached her children, though their reactions were different. Mark, as expected, remained cold and practical. It was only a matter of time, he thought, as he paused from his busy schedule to prepare for the trip to the nursing home. Laura, on her part, felt a pang of discomfort, but she didn't allow that feeling to affect her much. Her mother's death didn't fit into the luxurious and superficial life she had built, so for her, it was just another event to deal with. Charles, though more affected than his siblings, didn't know how to process his mother's death. He had always been lost in his own chaos, and now, without Elena's stable presence in his life, he felt completely adrift. The funeral was simple, just as Elena would have wanted. There were no grand ceremonies or speeches. Neighbors from the village attended in silence, many remembering Elena as a strong, selfless woman. Mark, Laura, and Charles kept their distance during the event, each lost in their own thoughts. None of them spoke much, and once the burial was over, they quickly began to plan their return to the city. However, before they could leave, Michael, the lawyer who had helped Elena with her will, gathered them in his office for the reading of her last wishes. The three siblings, though somewhat annoyed by the interruption, agreed to attend, expecting the process to be brief. None of them imagined that what they were about to hear would forever change the way they remembered their mother. Michael's office was bathed in the soft light of dusk as the three siblings sat in front of the lawyer. Michael, with a serious but calm expression, carefully opened Elena's will. He knew that what he was about to read was not a simple distribution of material goods, but something much deeper. "Your mother, Eleanor, asked me to deliver a very special message to you," Michael began, his voice clear. "Before proceeding with the distribution of her assets, I would like to give you some letters she wrote for each of you." Michael pulled out 3 envelopes, each labeled with one of the children's names, and placed them in front of them. Mark, always practical, took his envelope without showing much emotion. Laura looked at him with curiosity, though her face showed some impatience. Charles, on the other hand, stared at the envelope for a moment, before daring to touch it. Michael explained that these letters contained their mother's true legacy beyond any material possession. "Your mother wanted to ensure that through these words you could understand what her life, sacrifices, and love for you truly meant. I suggest you read them before proceeding with any other matters." With some skepticism, the 3 siblings opened their letters in silence. As they read, the atmosphere in the room changed radically. Elena's words, written in simple, firm handwriting, began to resonate deeply within each of them. Letter to Mark. "Mark, my dear son, I know you have always been a strong, determined man, and in many ways, you remind me of your father. But I want you to remember something. Life is not only measured by what we accumulate, but by the moments we share with those we love. I know you have always pursued success, and I am proud of your ambition, but don't let that distance you from the people who matter to you. Sometimes, in the pursuit of our goals, we forget what truly matters. Love and family are the true achievements in life. I hope that when you read these words, you understand that my sacrifice was not only for you to achieve success, but so that you would know how to value what is in your heart." Letter to Laura. "Laura, my little one, since you were a child, you have always dreamed of a world full of bright lights and great opportunities. I'm glad you found your way, but I want to remind you of something important. The life you live is not just about what you possess or the status you achieve. It's about the people you love and the moments you share with them. Remember the days when you played in the garden, when happiness wasn't in the material things, but in the little things. Don't lose that sense of what is simple and true. Even though we are far apart now, I will always be with you, in the memories and in the lessons I tried to teach you. Letter to Charles. Charles, my youngest son, I know you have always struggled and that sometimes you have felt lost. I want you to know that I never judged you for that. We all make mistakes, but what matters is learning from them and moving forward. I've left you some money to help pay your debts, but I want you to do something more. Use part of that money to help someone in need. No matter how small, an act of kindness always makes an impact. I hope you find the path that makes you happy and understand that true success is not in what you achieve for yourself, but in what you do for others. As each sibling read their letter, the expressions on their faces changed. Mark, always calculating and focused on success, looked bewildered by his mother's words. Laura, who had lived seeking external validation, felt a sting of nostalgia and guilt for all she had ignored over the years. And Charles, with tears in his eyes, realized that despite his mistakes, his mother had always believed in him. When they finished reading, the room fell silent. None of the three siblings knew what to say. Eleanor's words, filled with love, sacrifice, and wisdom, had struck them in a way they hadn't anticipated. It was as if, even in death, their mother had found a way to bring them together, to remind them of what truly mattered. Michael, aware of the impact the letters had made, continued with the reading of the will, but the focus was no longer on material goods. What Eleanor had left them was much deeper than any inheritance. She had left them a lesson in life, a reminder of the unconditional love she had always given, even when they had failed to appreciate it. After reading their mother's letters and will, the three siblings left Michael's office in a deafening silence. Each was lost in their thoughts, trying to process the words Elena had left for them. It was as if suddenly their mother's voice resonated louder in death than in life. There was something in those letters that profoundly moved them, something that forced them to confront the truth of who they had become and how their priorities had distorted the values she had taught them. Mark, the first to leave, got into his car and drove back to the city. His face maintained the cold, controlled expression he had learned to perfect over the past years. But inside, his mother's letter kept swirling in his mind. Every word he had read felt like a mirror, reflecting his empty ambitions and his disconnection from family. He had spent so much time chasing material success, believing that was the way to honor his mother's sacrifices, that he had forgotten the essence of what she truly valued: love, family, shared moments. As he drove down the road, the urban landscape began to emerge on the horizon. The towering buildings, symbols of all he had achieved, stood before him. But in that moment, they no longer held the same appeal. Mark remembered the childhood he had shared with his siblings, the simple moments when all that mattered was being together. His mother had given everything, sacrificing her own dreams so he could pursue his. But now he realized he had lost something far more valuable in the process. In the days that followed, Mark couldn't concentrate on work as he used to. His mother's words haunted him. "Don't let success distance you from the people who matter." Those words invaded his thoughts every time he tried to disconnect his mind from the past. In an act that surprised even his colleagues, he began to reduce his workload. Mark knew that money was not everything, and although it was hard for him to admit, he wanted to reconnect with what he had sidelined: his family. Laura, on her part, returned to the city with her mind tangled in a mix of nostalgia and guilt. She had spent so many years chasing the superficial life she had always dreamed of, believing that was what would make her happy. But her mother's letter had stirred something deep within her. "Remember the simple and true things," Eleanor had written, referring to the moments of her childhood when happiness was not tied to appearances or material possessions. Laura realized she had lost touch with what truly mattered. Back in her luxurious apartment, surrounded by expensive objects and a life many would consider enviable, Laura felt a void she had never experienced before. Her mother, in her letter, had reminded her that true happiness was not found in what one possessed, but in the human connections and genuine love shared with others. For the first time in years, Laura looked in the mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back at her. She had built a life based on superficiality, but her mother had always valued what was deep and simple. Laura began to distance herself from the social circles she had once deemed indispensable. She realized she had lived a life based on appearances, but those appearances hadn't brought her the peace she sought. She decided to reconnect with the things that had once made her happy, the books she had read as a child, walks in nature, and above all, spending time with her family. She called Mark and Charles, trying to initiate a conversation that would bring them back together, something she hadn't done in years. Although it was difficult at first, Laura knew she had to make the effort. Charles, on the other hand, stayed in the village a few more days. His mother's letter had touched him deeply. Unlike his siblings, Charles had always felt like he had fallen short, that he had never lived up to the expectations the family had for him. However, his mother had never judged him that way. In her letter, she spoke of forgiveness, second chances, and the importance of helping others. Charles, who had been trapped in a cycle of poor choices, felt for the first time that he could still change his life. His mother had left him money to pay his debts, but she had also given him a mission, to use part of that money to do something good for others. At first, the idea intimidated him. He wasn't used to thinking of others in that way, but his mother's words gave him the strength to try. One afternoon, while walking through the streets of the village, Charles encountered an elderly man who seemed to be struggling to carry some bags. Remembering his mother's words, Charles approached to help him. That small action, though seemingly insignificant, made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, a genuine connection with another person. It was a small step, but for Charles, it marked the beginning of a path toward redemption. Over the following weeks, Charles began to engage in small acts of kindness in the village. He helped at the local church, offered his time to those in need, and gradually found a purpose he had never known. His mother's words guided him with each step, reminding him that true success wasn't in what he achieved for himself, but in what he could do for others. The three siblings, although leading different lives, began to change profoundly. Elena's words, her special message, resonated in their hearts. Each one, in their own way, started to reconnect with the values their mother had taught them as children, values they had forgotten at some point in their adult lives. Although the path to reconciliation wasn't easy, all three understood that their mother's love and sacrifice had not been in vain. One day, weeks after the reading of the will, Mark, Laura, and Charles gathered in the family home, the same one they had emotionally abandoned years before. It was empty, filled with memories of their childhood, the laughter and games they once shared. They sat together in the living room, saying little at first, but knowing that somehow their mother had accomplished what she hadn't been able to do in life: bring them together once more. "We need to stick together," Laura finally said, breaking the silence. "That's what Mom always wanted." Mark nodded, his expression softer than his siblings were used to seeing. "It's not too late to change." Charles, for his part, smiled with a contained sadness. "Mom gave us a second chance. Let's not waste it." The three remained silent for a few more minutes, contemplating the legacy of love and sacrifice their mother had left them. Though Eleanor was no longer with them, her presence was palpable in every corner of that house, in every memory they shared. And somehow, they knew that although late, they had found their way back to what truly mattered: family. The months following the reading of Elena's will marked a turning point in her children's lives. Though each took a different path, their mother's words continued to resonate within them, silently yet steadily guiding their decisions. For the first time in years, the three siblings began to rebuild the bonds that time and distance had broken. Mark, though still focused on his career, started to prioritize family moments. His material success no longer held the same allure, and he discovered that true satisfaction lay in the small things, like an afternoon spent with his siblings or a heartfelt conversation. His calls to Laura and Charles became more frequent, and occasionally he visited the old family home, not just to remember, but to reconnect. Laura, who had lived so distantly from her family, also changed. She abandoned the superficial lifestyle she had built and began to reconnect with her roots. She visited the family home whenever she could, and during those visits, she rediscovered the value of the simple things her mother had always wanted to teach her. Often, she would sit in the garden that Elena loved so much, recalling the words from her letter and finding in them the peace she had always sought. Charles, who had been the most lost of the three, found a new direction in his life. The small acts of kindness his mother had inspired him to perform led him to become more involved in his community. He found a purpose in helping others, something he never imagined would bring him so much peace. And although his path was still uncertain, he knew his mother would be proud of what he was building. The three siblings, though still facing their own challenges, began to spend more time together. It was no longer about appearances or competing for success, but about being present and honoring the legacy Elena had left them. The value of family, unconditional love, and the sacrifice that had always been at the heart of their mother. 1 year after Elena's death, the three siblings gathered in the family home. It had been a while since they had all been together in that place. Sitting around the dining table, where they had shared countless meals in their childhood, they raised a glass in honor of their mother. "To Mom," said Mark, with a serene smile. "To everything she taught us," added Laura, moved. "And for what continues to live in us," concluded Charles, with a shy but sincere smile. Elena, though no longer physically with them, remained present in each of their hearts. Her special message had accomplished what she had long desired, to unite her children and remind them of what truly mattered. A mother's sacrifice, after all, is not measured by the years lived, but by the lessons left in the hearts of those she loves most. And so, Elena's legacy endured, not in material goods or great achievements, but in the unity of her family, in the love they shared, and in the promise that they would always be there for one another. And so we come to the end of this emotional story. Elena's life has reminded us of the true value of sacrifice and the power of family love, even in the most difficult moments. Sometimes the most important lessons come late, but there's always time to reconnect with what truly matters. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to leave us a comment and share your thoughts. We'd love to know how it has inspired you. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to not miss any of our stories filled with emotions and reflections. Until next time, and remember that stories unite us, even across distances.